Close your eyes and travel back 15,000 years, long before pyramids, kingdoms, or cities. This is the forgotten dawn of humanity, when small groups of people first began to settle, experiment with survival, and slowly shape the foundation of civilization. Welcome to the story of life before history was ever written. For most of human existence, life was shaped by constant movement. Our earliest ancestors were nomadic hunter-gatherers, drifting across vast landscapes in search of food, shelter, and safety. Their world was unpredictable, defined by the cycles of the seasons, the migration of animals, and the availability of plants. Each decision to move or to stay was a matter of survival. They carried little with them, just what was necessary, because the ability to move swiftly was as valuable as the ability to find food. The rhythm of their lives was tied to the environment, and this connection left deep marks on their culture, beliefs, and understanding of the world around them. 15,000 years ago, the planet was just beginning to emerge from the grip of the last ice age. Glaciers that had covered enormous parts of the northern hemisphere were retreating, and landscapes were slowly transforming. Rivers carved new paths, fertile valleys opened up, and herds of animals began to roam wider territories. The climate, though still harsh, was gradually becoming more stable in some regions, which created new opportunities for human groups. For millennia, people had followed the animals, living in temporary shelters, gathering berries, nuts, and roots, and hunting whenever they could. But as the environment began to change, so too did the patterns of human life. Nomadic groups, once constantly in motion, began to discover places where food was more abundant and predictable. Fertile river valleys, lakeshores, and coastal areas offered steady resources, and some groups realized that returning to the same location each year increased their chances of survival. These temporary camps slowly transformed into more permanent sites. Instead of moving with the seasons, people began to store food, build sturdier shelters, and rely more on the land around them. This was not yet farming as we understand it, but it was the first step towards settling down. It was a subtle shift, born out of necessity, experimentation, and adaptation. In these emerging settlements, people started to notice the cycles of plants. They saw that seeds dropped on the ground could sprout again in the same place the following year. They learned which plants grew well near water, which ones provided the best food, and which could be stored through harsh winters. This knowledge accumulated slowly, passed from one generation to the next. At first, they may have encouraged the growth of wild plants by scattering seeds or protecting certain patches of land. This was the seed of agriculture, though it would take many centuries before farming became the dominant way of life. For now, the act of staying in one place allowed them to observe, experiment, and gain control over nature in ways their ancestors had not. The shift from nomadic life to settled existence also changed social structures. In mobile groups, survival depended on flexibility and shared responsibility. Everyone had a role to play, and belongings were minimal. In settled groups, however, new dynamics emerged. People could now accumulate tools, pottery, and other possessions, because they no longer had to carry them from place to place. Storage pits were dug into the ground to hold grains, nuts, or dried meat. Permanent or semi-permanent dwellings meant more effort went into construction, and with that came a sense of place and territory. For the first time, people began to associate themselves not just with their group, but with a location, a patch of land that they considered their home. Archaeological evidence from sites like Natufian culture in the Levant shows how these early communities began to organize themselves. They built circular stone houses with defined hearths, and their settlements grew larger than typical nomadic camps. Graves were found near homes, suggesting a new relationship with ancestors and the land itself. Life was no longer only about moving toward the next hunt. It was about maintaining and protecting a place that had meaning, both practical and spiritual. The simple act of burying someone within or near a settlement indicated a permanent tie to the land, a bond that nomads had not experienced in the same way. This shift also altered the rhythm of daily life. Hunters still ventured out, and foragers still gathered, but now their movements were anchored to a central base. Children grew up in a single environment, learning the features of the landscape intimately. Women could process food in larger quantities, grind grains into flour, or prepare meals that could be shared by larger groups. Men could craft more sophisticated tools, knowing that they had a place to keep them. The community as a whole could plan for the future in ways that were impossible when life was spent chasing resources across long distances. Staying in one place, however, brought challenges. Waste accumulated, diseases spread more easily, and disputes over land and resources could emerge. A family or group that invested effort into clearing a patch of ground or building a shelter might not want to share it freely with newcomers. These tensions gave rise to early forms of boundaries and ownership, concepts that would later shape societies and civilizations. The need to resolve conflicts and organize collective labor may have been one of the sparks that eventually led to more formal social hierarchies. What had once been small, loosely structured bands of people gradually became more complex communities with emerging rules, traditions, and leadership roles. The decision to settle also changed how humans viewed time. Nomads lived according to short-term cycles: the next hunt, the next migration, the next season. Settlers, on the other hand, had to think about planting, harvesting, and storing food for months ahead. They developed a long-term perspective, tracking the movements of the sun, the phases of the moon, and the changing seasons with greater precision. Calendars, rituals, and myths emerged from these observations, embedding the cycles of nature into culture and belief. The concept of the future, planning beyond immediate survival, became deeply ingrained in the lives of early settlers. The material culture of these groups also blossomed. Pottery became more common because it was no longer a burden to carry heavy vessels. With pottery, people could cook in new ways, store liquids, and preserve food longer. Tools became more specialized, with grinding stones, sickles, and other implements designed for processing plants. Art flourished too, from carved figurines to decorative patterns on everyday objects. These creations were not merely functional, they expressed identity, spirituality, and an emerging sense of community belonging. At the same time, the relationship between humans and animals began to shift. While hunting remained crucial, people discovered the advantages of keeping certain animals closer to their settlements. Dogs, domesticated long before this period, became companions and hunting aids, but other animals like goats and sheep were slowly being tamed. The possibility of controlling herds rather than chasing them was a revolutionary idea. It required staying in one place, investing in enclosures, and protecting animals from predators. This partnership with animals paralleled the gradual domestication of plants, both of which tied humans more tightly to the land. The psychological impact of settling down cannot be understated. For countless generations, humans had been wanderers, their identities tied to movement and the chase. Now, with permanent dwellings, people began to create stories, traditions, and memories tied to specific places. Caves and hills took on sacred meaning. Hearths became the center of family life. Fields and rivers were no longer just resources. They were part of the community's very existence. The idea of home was born, not just as a shelter but as a deeply emotional and cultural anchor. The transition from nomadic to settled life was not sudden or universal. Many groups continued to live as hunter-gatherers for thousands of years alongside emerging agricultural communities. In some regions, environmental conditions made settlement difficult or unnecessary, while in others it provided clear advantages. This coexistence of lifestyles created a dynamic world where knowledge and practices spread through contact, trade, and migration. Ideas about planting, animal domestication, and building techniques passed from one group to another, accelerating the pace of change in certain areas. Yet even as settlements grew, people still relied on the skills of their nomadic ancestors. Hunting remained essential, mobility was sometimes necessary in times of drought or scarcity, and the memory of a wandering lifestyle lingered in traditions and stories. Settled life was not an absolute break, but an adaptation, blending the old with the new. Over time, however, the advantages of settlement, food security, community support, cultural richness, began to outweigh the limitations of constant mobility. Archaeological findings from various parts of the world, from the Fertile Crescent to East Asia and the Americas, reveal a similar pattern of experimentation. People discovered local plants that could be cultivated, such as wheat and barley in the Middle East, rice in China, and maize in Mesoamerica. These early steps toward agriculture All began with the decision to settle, to stay long enough in one place to notice the cycles of growth, to intervene in nature, and to reap the rewards. The global story of humanity's shift from nomads to settlers unfolded in different ways across continents. Yet the underlying theme remained the same: the recognition that staying put could offer stability, abundance, and a new way of life. The first settlements were small, often no more than a few families living together, but they planted the seeds for something far greater. The patterns they established: farming, animal domestication, storage, permanent homes, social organization, would eventually expand into villages, towns, and cities. What began as a survival strategy became the foundation of civilization itself. Humanity had taken its first step away from the endless journey across the wild landscapes of the Ice Age, anchoring itself instead to land, memory, and the promise of a more secure future. When human beings first began to experiment with planting and tending the land, it was not the sudden invention of agriculture that textbooks sometimes make it seem. It was instead a slow and subtle transformation, a collection of tiny discoveries passed from one person to another, from one generation to the next. For thousands of years, people had gathered wild grains, fruits, roots, and nuts, carefully watching the seasons and knowing which plants thrived in which conditions. They observed how seeds scattered by accident would sprout in the following season, how plants near rivers grew larger and stronger, and how certain soils were more generous than others. Out of these observations came the earliest sparks of farming, not as a deliberate decision to change humanity's destiny, but as an extension of the foraging practices that had sustained people for millennia. In regions such as the Fertile Crescent, wild wheat and barley grew in abundance. Small groups of people began to collect these grains more systematically, sometimes returning to the same fields year after year. Instead of wandering endlessly in search of food, they started to see the advantage of encouraging growth where food was reliable. Some scattered seeds intentionally after harvest, perhaps at first simply to make gathering easier in the following season. Over time, they realized that with care, these plants could be coaxed into providing larger yields. It was a gradual process of trial and error, guided by instinct, necessity, and careful attention to the land. What began as gathering soon became tending, and what was once wild began to move toward the domesticated. The first sparks of farming also included the beginnings of animal domestication. Wild dogs had long been companions and aids in hunting. Other animals like goats, sheep, and pigs started to be drawn closer to human settlements. People noticed that animals grazing near their camps were easier to hunt or to capture alive, and keeping a few animals nearby reduced the uncertainty of the hunt. Young animals could be raised for food, milk, or hides, and breeding them within controlled spaces slowly transformed their behavior and characteristics. This relationship between people and animals was another layer of security, another form of stability in a world where survival had always been precarious. Farming and herding together formed the twin pillars of this new way of life, changing the rhythm of human existence forever. With the ability to produce food rather than only gather it, human communities experienced a profound shift. Food surpluses, however small at first, allowed groups to support more people in one place. Settlements grew larger, and the need to cooperate became greater. Farming required coordinated labor, preparing soil, planting, tending, harvesting, and storing food. These tasks could not be managed by isolated individuals alone. They demanded cooperation, timing, and shared responsibility. Families worked together, neighbors supported one another, and slowly, community life began to take shape in a more structured form. This new sense of interdependence was unlike the looser bonds of nomadic bands. It tied people together not only through kinship, but through shared investment in the land and its resources. The act of staying in one place and farming also encouraged the creation of new technologies. Tools became more specialized, designed to make agricultural tasks easier and more efficient. Grinding stones appeared for processing grains, sickles with sharp flint blades were crafted for cutting stalks, and later, digging sticks and primitive plows emerged for working the soil. These tools marked a step away from the purely opportunistic approach of foragers and hunters. They were part of a new toolkit designed for shaping and managing the environment, a sign that humans were no longer passive participants in nature's cycles, but active shapers of it. Every tool carried within it the memory of labor, the rhythm of planting and harvesting, the sweat of shared work, and the promise of food security. The stability provided by farming also allowed communities to experiment with new forms of shelter. Instead of temporary huts or simple structures, people began building more durable homes with stone foundations, mud bricks, or wooden frames. Roofs were thatched, walls were plastered, and floors were sometimes smoothed with clay. These homes reflected the permanence of the new lifestyle and provided space not only for sleeping, but for storing food and tools. The hearth became the heart of the household, a place of warmth, cooking, and gathering. Around these homes, storage pits, granaries, and enclosures for animals created the physical outline of community life, with each feature reflecting a deeper reliance on farming and settled existence. As farming took root, so too did social complexity. With surpluses of food, not everyone needed to spend every waking hour gathering or hunting. Some individuals could focus on crafting tools, making pottery, weaving textiles, or experimenting with new forms of art. Others might become leaders mediating disputes, organizing labor, or guiding rituals. Farming provided the foundation for specialization, which in turn enriched community life. This specialization fostered trade as well, with communities exchanging surplus food, crafted goods, or raw materials. Slowly, networks of interaction stretched across larger regions, linking settlements into wider webs of cultural exchange. The sparks of farming ignited not just new ways of feeding people, but new ways of organizing societies. The presence of permanent communities also gave rise to new cultural practices and spiritual ideas. For nomadic groups, spirits and deities were often tied to the hunt, the movement of animals, and the unpredictability of the landscape. Settled farmers, however, found their spiritual lives increasingly connected to the cycles of the earth. Rituals emerged to mark planting and harvest, to invoke fertility for fields and animals, to protect the community from droughts or floods. Fertility figurines, carvings, and symbols reflected a growing reverence for the land and its life, giving potential. Temples and communal gathering places eventually appeared, built not for mobility but for permanence, anchoring spirituality to the heart of the community. These early expressions of religion reinforced the shared identity of the group, uniting people in belief as well as labor. Farming also changed how time was perceived and measured. While nomads lived according to short cycles of hunting and gathering, farmers had to track the seasons with precision. They needed to know when to plant and when to harvest, when to expect rains or floods, and when to prepare for the harshness of winter. This need led to the observation of celestial movements. The sun, moon, and stars became guides for agricultural calendars. The night sky became a map of time itself, a way of organizing human labor in harmony with the larger rhythms of the earth and cosmos. The invention of calendars and the development of seasonal rituals were cultural echoes of the practical demands of farming. The accumulation of food and possessions within communities also created new challenges. Surpluses required protection, leading to storage solutions and eventually defensive measures. Disputes over land, water, or food became more common, and methods of resolving conflict had to be developed. Leaders or councils likely emerged to settle disagreements, and traditions of property and inheritance began to take shape. These were the earliest foundations of law and governance, the beginnings of organized authority that would later develop into more formal political systems. Farming communities, by anchoring people to land and resources, made such systems necessary, for cooperation could not thrive without some form of structure and order. The sparks of farming were not limited to a single region. In East Asia, people began cultivating rice in the wetlands of the Yangtze River basin. In the Americas, maize gradually evolved from wild grasses into a staple crop. In Africa, sorghum and millet became central to early communities, while in the Andes, potatoes and quinoa supported high-altitude settlements. Each region discovered and nurtured its own crops, but the pattern remained strikingly similar. Gathering gave way to tending, tending gave way to cultivation, and cultivation gave way to farming. The specifics differed, but the essence was the same. Humans learned to harness the cycles of plants and animals, transforming their relationship with the natural world and creating the first sparks of community life. These agricultural revolutions also encouraged greater population density. Where once only small groups could survive together, farming allowed dozens or even hundreds of people to live in close proximity. Villages began to form, with houses clustered together, pathways winding between them, and shared spaces for work or ritual. In these villages, children grew up surrounded by a larger network of people, learning not just from their parents, but from neighbors, elders, and specialists. Community identity became stronger, traditions deeper, and collective memory richer. Storytelling, rituals, and shared labor forged bonds that transcended immediate kinship, weaving individuals into the fabric of a larger social whole. The sparks of farming also reshaped gender roles and family structures. While hunter-gatherer societies often distributed tasks based on mobility and physical demands, farming introduced new patterns of labor. Women frequently played central roles in planting, tending, and processing crops, while men contributed to land clearing, herding, or hunting. The rhythms of agricultural life intertwined family labor more closely, tying households to the cycles of the fields. The stability of settlements allowed for larger families, and with more mouths to feed, the importance of farming only deepened. Over time, these dynamics influenced inheritance, property, and even social hierarchies, embedding farming practices into the very structure of human relationships. As farming communities expanded, so too did their impact on the environment. Forests were cleared for fields, rivers diverted for irrigation, and landscapes reshaped to meet human needs. What had once been a relatively balanced relationship between people and nature began to tilt as humans exerted more control over ecosystems. Species of plants and animals were domesticated, altering biodiversity and changing the natural order. These transformations, though modest at first, laid the groundwork for the profound environmental changes that would accompany later civilizations. Humanity had taken its first steps toward reshaping the planet in ways that would echo through millennia. The sparks of farming and community life represented not just a change in subsistence, but a fundamental redefinition of what it meant to be human. No longer entirely at the mercy of chance, people could now plan, create, and build with greater security. Their communities became more than survival groups. They became societies with culture, memory, and identity rooted in place. The land provided not only sustenance but meaning, the harvest not only food, but a reason to gather and celebrate. The settlement not only shelter but a stage upon which the drama of human history would unfold. Would me to also expand Keynote Note 3 in the same 3,000 word storytelling style, so you'll have a complete long form script for your video. You said Keynote Note 3. Expand it into 3,000 words. Don't add ending sentences. Don't add any headings, ChatGPT said. Here's a continuous 3,000 word style expansion of Keynote No. 3 Survival, Rituals, and the Roots of Civilization, written as narrative flow, no headings. I'll go down, survival for early human communities was never something taken for granted. Even after the first sparks of farming and settlement, nature was unpredictable. Weather could turn against them, crops could fail, herds could scatter, and disease could spread through close quarters. Every day was shaped by the awareness that life was fragile, and this fragility drove people to create systems of meaning, ritual practices, and cultural traditions that helped them endure. The act of survival was not only about finding food and shelter, but also about building the social and spiritual frameworks that gave purpose and resilience to human life. From these frameworks grew the roots of what would later become civilization, for it was through ritual and shared culture that small groups of people bound themselves into communities stronger than the sum of their parts. Hunting still played a central role in survival, even as agriculture began to anchor life. Large animals such as aurochs, deer, or gazelle provided meat, hides, and bones that were essential for tools and clothing. Hunting required planning, cooperation, and skill, bringing members of the community together in coordinated effort. Success in the hunt was never guaranteed, and rituals often surrounded it. Hunters carried charms, performed dances, or painted animals on cave walls as acts of preparation, expressing both hope and reverence. These practices were not simply superstition but psychological tools, giving courage and unity to those facing dangerous tasks. The hunt bound communities to the natural world and to each other, and through repeated success and failure, The rituals of survival became traditions woven deeply into cultural identity. Foraging remained just as vital. Women and children often gathered nuts, berries, roots, and herbs, knowledge of which was passed carefully across generations. They knew which plants healed wounds, which relieved fevers, which were safe to eat, and which brought sickness or death. This expertise was a survival skill equal to hunting, a kind of living library that safeguarded the community. Gathering was not just about calories but about health and medicine, and the transmission of this knowledge was itself a ritual. Songs, stories, and practices encoded the information in ways that could be remembered and shared, transforming practical necessity into cultural heritage. In this sense, ritual was as much about survival as any spear or blade. Life in permanent settlements introduced new dangers. When people lived close together, waste accumulated, water sources became polluted, and illnesses spread more easily than in small, mobile groups. The survival of the community depended on developing practices to minimize these risks. Fire became a tool not only for cooking but for sanitation and protection. Communal rules about where to discard waste, how to prepare food, or when to clean spaces were more than practical guidelines. They evolved into rituals reinforced by tradition and belief. Over time, these small acts of hygiene and order became the seeds of social regulation, the earliest forms of communal law, ensuring that the community could endure in a fragile balance with its environment. As people became more dependent on crops and herds, the success or failure of a harvest determined survival. This dependence gave rise to rituals of fertility and renewal. Communities developed ceremonies to mark the planting season, invoking forces they believed controlled rain, sun, and soil. They created offerings to ensure abundance, celebrated the first shoots of crops, and mourned when fields failed. The cycles of agriculture were not only physical but spiritual rhythms, tying human life to the land in patterns that required acknowledgement through ritual. These practices served not only to appease imagined powers, but to unify the community in shared hope, resilience, and patience. When times were hard, rituals offered comfort, and when times were good, they offered celebration, both of which strengthened social cohesion. Burial practices reflected another dimension of survival, not of the body, but of memory. Early settlements began to bury their dead with care, placing them under homes in communal spaces or in specially designated areas. Objects such as tools, beads, or figurines were placed with the deceased, suggesting a belief in continuity beyond death. Ancestors became part of the community's survival, not physically but spiritually, as guardians, guides, or sources of legitimacy. Rituals of burial and remembrance preserved identity and continuity, ensuring that each generation saw itself as part of a larger story. This sense of connection across time was itself a survival mechanism, giving people the strength to endure hardship by grounding them in something greater than their individual lives. As settlements grew larger, rituals expanded beyond the family or household and became communal events. Feasting played a central role, where food was shared not only as sustenance, but as a symbol of unity. Feasts marked harvests, births, marriages, and even victories in conflict. They redistributed resources within the community, reinforcing bonds and ensuring that no one was left completely isolated. Music, dance, and storytelling accompanied these gatherings, embedding social memory in performance and creating shared experiences that strengthened collective identity. These acts of ritualized community life laid the foundation for institutions that would later define civilizations, organized religion, governance, and cultural traditions rooted in collective participation. The roots of civilization were also visible in the way people began to shape their environment in deliberate, symbolic ways. Monuments and communal structures appeared, requiring coordinated labor far beyond the needs of daily survival. Göbekli Tepe, for instance, with its massive carved pillars arranged in circles, represents one of the earliest examples of humans gathering to create a sacred space. These structures were not homes or storage pits, they were ritual centers built to embody shared beliefs and identities. Their existence demonstrates how rituals were powerful enough to mobilize entire communities, to organize labor, and to sustain cooperative projects larger than any one family or household. In these communal efforts lay the roots of organized society, the seeds of what would later grow into cities, temples, and states. Conflict was another reality of survival. For not every group could thrive without encountering competition. Scarcity of land, water, or resources inevitably brought clashes between neighboring communities. Rituals of warfare and reconciliation emerged, often involving symbols, ceremonies, and codes that shaped how violence was carried out and how peace was restored. These rituals gave structure to conflict, preventing chaos and embedding even violence within cultural frameworks. Out of such practices came the earliest hints of diplomacy, alliances, and systems of justice, all of which were necessary for long-term survival in increasingly complex human landscapes. The human mind, seeking patterns and meaning in a world of uncertainty, wove survival itself into myth. Stories were told to explain the seasons, the cycles of the moon, the mystery of birth and death, and the forces that controlled the world. These stories were not only entertainment, but guides for behavior, reinforcing rituals, teaching values, and embedding knowledge into memory. Myth and ritual together formed the symbolic foundation of early communities, giving people a shared worldview that sustained them through adversity. In this way, survival was not merely physical, but cultural, for without shared meaning and tradition, communities would fracture and fade. The roots of civilization can be seen in the gradual formalization of these practices. Rules about food, marriage, burial, and labor became more fixed over time, passed down not as suggestions but as obligations. The authority to interpret and enforce these rules often fell to specific individuals, elders, shamans, or leaders, who became the first figures of organized leadership. Their role was not simply practical but spiritual, linking the community to both the physical and the unseen worlds. Through them, rituals gained legitimacy, survival strategies gained order, and the seeds of institutional power were sown. In these early leaders lay the origins of kings, priests, and rulers who would later dominate the civilizations that followed. Trade was another dimension of survival and ritual that helped lay the roots of civilization. Communities exchanged obsidian, flint, shells, pigments, and crafted goods, creating networks that extended far beyond a single settlement. These exchanges were not purely economic but often accompanied by ritual, gift-giving, and symbolic meaning. Trade connected communities across distances, spreading not only material goods but ideas, beliefs, and technologies. In this web of exchange lay the early threads of regional cultures, the foundations of larger civilizations that would eventually rise. The act of giving, receiving, and reciprocating carried weight beyond survival, embedding relationships in trust, ritual, and mutual obligation. Art and symbolic expression were also bound to survival and ritual. Carvings, figurines, cave paintings, and decorated pottery were not luxuries but integral to the life of the community. They represented fertility, animals, ancestors, or cosmological forces, embodying the beliefs that sustained human resilience. These creations served as reminders of identity and continuity, visual anchors for rituals that unified the community. Art carried knowledge and meaning across generations, ensuring that survival was reinforced not only by food and shelter, but by imagination and memory. The creative impulse, tied to ritual, was as vital to human endurance as any practical tool. As generations passed, these practices became traditions so ingrained that they defined what it meant to live as part of a community. Survival was no longer a matter of individuals against the wilderness, but of societies bound by ritual, memory, and shared labor. The roots of civilization lay in this transformation, in the recognition that human life was stronger when embedded in culture, ritual, and collective identity. These were the invisible structures that supported the visible ones: the fields, the homes, the granaries, and eventually the temples and walls. Without ritual, community would have been fragile. Without survival strategies bound to meaning, early settlements would not have endured long enough to give rise to the civilizations that followed.